Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hey everyone, welcome back to our series on key battles of the Revolutionary War. In the previous episode, we saw the Declaration of Independence being signed and America formally announcing itself to the world as an independent country.
Woohoo!
James, does that mean the confusion is now behind us so we don't have to call them colonists or patriots or whatever and we could just call them Americans?
I think that's safe to do from now on. Let's do that. I like that idea.
All right, well, terminology is much more simple, but the war is not simple. It is going to get down and dirty. We're not going to have small little skirmishes here with a few hundred soldiers that are symbolic. Things are going to get hairy, and things are going to happen in New York, which was in some senses always going to be a destination of the British. But before we go back into this narrative, I just want to set up a little bit about what is happening in the war and how New York is indicative of how, in some senses, the British war planning was schizophrenic. Because on one hand, they have a rebellion that they have to put down, and England has a global, Britain has a global empire at this point, and they're not subtle when it comes to such matters. But on the other hand, the king knew that he had a problem if he was too harsh and turned the colonies into a permanent enemy. And the leaders of this war effort, the Howe brothers, one who commanded the British fleet, which was Sir Richard Howe, and the other, the British Army, General William Howe, whom we've met earlier, they were charged with ending the rebellion, but they were also peace commissioners. And General Howe had already unsuccessfully attempted to crush the rebellion at Bunker Hill through a demonstration of raw British power. This didn't work. This just left the British with heavy casualties, but it also strengthened American resolve and inspired the Patriots to believe that they could eventually beat England. So there's something that's happening here. It's kind of like the Vietnam War, where the people trying to fight the battle are moving back and forth between the carrot and the stick, and they don't know if they want to win the war, crush them, or befriend the inhabitants. And these policies go back and forth. So that's the context of what's happening. But let's move now to New York and see where we're at in the war effort. So, James, can you set us up with some background?
Okay, we left the British Army, the main British Army. We left them a couple episodes back in Boston, and they evacuated Boston in the spring of 1776, being surrounded by up to possibly 20,000, we'll call them colonials at that time because they were still colonials, but we're going to put that to bed. Washington's army, a combined force of Continental Army and militia, had nearly 20,000. And the British were bottled up on that that ping pong battle that we keep talking about. I think maybe this will be the last time, Scott.
It's too bad.
Anyway, they leave and they go to Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is a very safe place for them for rest and refit, resupply. But George Washington wasn't stupid. He knew that they're not just going to go, let's just go there permanently. He knew that they were going to be back to the American colonies. And he was pretty sure it was going to be New York City. So, being really convinced of this, about 2 weeks after the British departure, he traveled to New York City to oversee the building of defenses. He wanted to be there personally and actually see it with his own eyes. He also organized the Continental Army into divisions, each of which had some Continentals and some militia units. He really didn't want to have all militia units and all Continentals, because he never really trusted militia. He'd worked with too many militia back in the French and Indian War. He'd commanded some militia. He wanted the army to be as professional as possible. Now, the army was suffering from disease, and many of the soldiers were leaving because their enlistments ran out. They also suffered from a shortage of supplies. They tried to recruit new soldiers, but this went slowly. Why would you go, if you're a farmer, why would you leave your farm and risk your family starving to go off and join the army and probably die of disease, but if not, possibly get shot or get blown up by a cannonball or some kind of explosive ordnance, and then hardly ever have any food? It's just not really, and not get paid. So it's not a really attractive prospect for a lot of prospering or even middle class or lower class American farmers. So it's really hard for Washington to get troops. Now, I want to talk about a man that we're going to see in several of our battles starting today, and that's one of Washington's key subordinates, and that was Major General Charles Lee. So let's stop and do a little mini bio on Charles Lee. Charles Lee had served in the British Army for 16 years, including the Battle of the Monongahela. We've talked about that battle. That was a key early battle in the French and Indian War, which was a disaster for the British. They were absolutely routed by the French and a combined French and Indian force. The commanding general, General Braddock, was killed, but Washington was there. Lee was there. Thomas Gage, who we talked about quite a while ago, Gage was out of the picture now, but he was there. I believe that General Gates, Horatio Gates, who we'll talk about a lot later, was there as well. So there were quite a few future commanders on both sides in the Revolutionary War at this battle, including Charles Lee. So Charles Lee was a professional soldier. He was not like Washington. Washington had served a few years in the Virginia militia back in the French and Indian War, and that was it. He'd been out of military service for quite some time. Not so Lee. Lee had fought, well, we'll talk more about his career a little bit later. Lee was a talkative man, so the opposite of Washington in that regard. He was profane. He had a potty mouth, we would say today, which Washington detested swearing. Washington used to outlaw swearing and even punish people for it from time to time.
Yeah, he would fine soldiers, or even worse if he heard them swearing.
Yeah, can you imagine that? You think of the military today as just, constant
Not quite the same
swearing.
system, yeah.
Yeah. Charles Lee was sloppy in his dress. He didn't really care how he looked. Again, the opposite of Washington. Washington was always just a fashion plate. That's I think that's an old term that nobody knows what it means anymore, Scott. I may need to define that. Basically, Washington was always perfectly attired. And Charles Lee was fond of being unconventional, which again, he couldn't be more opposite than Washington. All those points that I just mentioned, exact 180-degree opposite from Washington. Now, Charles Lee had married the daughter of a Seneca chief. So he'd kind of got himself an Indian bride. He had fought in North America, as I mentioned, and he'd also fought in Portugal. In 1765, he joined the Polish army. So he'd really fought all over the world, at least all over the Western world. In 1775, he was appointed as a major general in the Continental Army, second only in rank to Washington. So he really was Washington's second in command. He was quick-tempered. He was arrogant. One thing I want to mention, Scott, is that he always went around with a bunch of dogs. He was never anywhere without 2, 3, 4 dogs. Just kind of an odd guy. He wouldn't ever leave his dogs behind. Guess he couldn't find a suitable kennel on the front lines.
They were his support animal. That's how he was able to function.
No kidding. Yeah. Washington had originally put Charles Lee in charge of New York City defenses. Later, he sent him down to Charleston, which we talked about in a previous episode. So that's Lee, really the antithesis of George Washington, and just kind of an odd guy.
Well, a fun fact about him, you mentioned he had vast military experience. He had quantity, if not the quality, of Washington. And for that reason, the Continental Congress, or many in that, originally wanted Lee to be commander-in-chief instead of Washington. So keep that in mind as we see how the war effort goes. I think things would have turned out a little bit differently if Lee had been in overall command. And you can decide for yourself, dear listener, if you think it would have been more positive or more negative.
Yeah, I think hold off on your judgment there. Some of you may have already made a judgment on that one, but wait till we talk about Lee's got some fun surprises planned for us later. So, all right. So let's talk about, you mentioned the Howe brothers.
Yes.
Admiral Sir Richard Howe, Lord Howe, as they would have called him at the time, and his brother General William Howe. They're working as a team to try to go down and snuff out the rebellion. But as you mentioned, it's not a scorched earth campaign. They're not there to search and destroy. They're using a gloved hand. So after William Howe left Boston, he took his army, as I mentioned, to Nova Scotia and got some time to just relax, get some rest, get some reinforcements, get some new supplies. Finally, on June 11th, Howe and the Army sailed for New York. On the way, he met up with his brother, Sir Admiral Richard Howe, the commander of the British Navy. Howe and his leading elements sailed into the lower bay in the New York area on June 25th. And there were so many ships that one American soldier wrote, "I thought all London was afloat." There was another quote I saw that it was like a forest of masts. There were just so many ships with their masts, and it was pretty awesome in the old-fashioned sense of the word, Scott. It was a shock and awe campaign, and it worked on a lot of the Americans. They were kind of like, uh-oh. Great. 4 days later, the rest of Howe's force arrived, and on July 3rd, the British troops landed unopposed on Staten Island. Now, let's do a mental map, Scott. I learned so much about New York geography when I was researching this. I being a Texas boy, I didn't know hardly anything. I've never been to New York City.
Yeah, listeners, please consult maps. We have them on the website, and New Yorkers assume everybody knows what the 5 boroughs are. We might recognize the name. I know that Manhattan is an island. I don't know anything about the geography of the rest of it. Guess what? If you're from New York, no one else knows anything, so get over yourself. And we're going to correct that lacuna in New York geographical knowledge here. So please consult the map, and James, as always, will do well explaining the geographical features.
Yes. So let me pull up our big picture map here and try to describe this to our listeners. Another thing, too, even if you know current New York geography, it was totally different back in 1776, just as Boston was. Okay, so you've got New York City proper at the time was way, way smaller than it is today, both in terms of population and in terms of geography. If you picture... how do we picture a finger coming down from the mainland? Okay, so from the north down in the middle of your mental map, here comes like a finger hanging down, or let's say a banana hanging down or something.
Or an udder, if you prefer.
An udder, yeah. That would be utterly hard to imagine, but
we're gonna milk this for all it's worth.
Good.
We'll be here all week, folks.
Yeah, listener, you just thought we were going to talk about the Battle of New York. We're actually going to just do puns the rest of the episode. All right, so on the left side, and I'm oversimplifying because the reality is it's more oriented northeast to southwest, but just work with me, listener. Think in your mental map, right down in the middle is coming an udder or a finger or a banana. To the left of that is the Hudson River. To the right of that is the East River. And then just below it, and also a little bit to the right side is Long Island. Okay, Long Island is huge compared to the finger, or the udder, and the udder is Manhattan Island. Okay, so Long Island is below it, below Manhattan, and to the right, and then to the left of Long Island, separated by New York Bay, is Staten Island. By the way, going back to the udder or the finger coming down, as I said, to the left is the Hudson. To the left of that is the mainland, and that's New Jersey. Okay, so the British are going to land on Staten Island, which is somewhat of a distance away from Manhattan itself, and just to the left of Long Island. All right, are you thoroughly confused, listener? I'm sorry if that wasn't very good, but if that didn't make sense, consult a map later. Okay, so they landed on Staten Island, and by August, they had 32,000 men, including 8,000 Hessians there. Those are those German mercenaries that we talked about, just really the ultimate professionals, just really scary, kick-butt soldiers. Admiral Howe issued a proclamation stating proposed peace terms, and he also sent letters proposing peace negotiations to the governors of the states of the area and to Washington himself. Now, Washington did agree to meet with the House, and that happened. He didn't meet with him personally. He met with an emissary, but nothing came of the meeting. So, Washington didn't feel like they wanted him to apologize and to admit wrongdoing, and he said, well, we haven't done anything wrong. We're standing up for our rights. Also, a delegation from Congress was sent, including John Adams, of course, and Benjamin Franklin, of course. Those guys are everywhere. We're constantly talking about them.